They said, we want you to be CIO of UBS. And I was like, oh, don't be stupid. I'm not technical enough. I can't possibly lead 20,000 technologists. But then I quickly realized that the request wasn't really a request. It was sort of an order to do that job.
Michele Trogni started her career in accounting. She rose to Group CIO at UBS and then became the CEO of Zinnia, a company backed by a $60 billion empire. She now sits on the board of Deutsche Bank, one of the biggest financial institutions in the world.
I love accounting. I mean, it sounds super boring, but in every business and every job I've ever had, being able to look at a balance sheet and understand what that's telling me about the health of the company has been invaluable. We were doing the merger with UBS. It was Y2K, and it was also the introduction of the euro. So there was this huge coming together of lots of different change initiatives. And then I got pregnant. The CIO at the time tapped me on the shoulder and said, okay, we need to have a discussion here. I am a data junkie. I think, if you have good, clean data, it really helps you run a business. You're not letting emotion create the answer or the narrative that you want it to create. You're thinking about what the data is telling you, and that will help you make better decisions.
What was it like working for one of the biggest banks in the world during the financial crisis?
I got a call from the COO and he said, meet me at the Fed 6 a.m. tomorrow morning. I remember sitting almost opposite Jamie Dimon. Ben Bernanke and Tim Geithner came in the room. I was like, oh my God, I might pass out now. There's so much power in this room, but realizing that nobody had the answers.
What would you say to your 28-year-old self?
So somebody gave me a great piece of advice.
Hey, Michele.
Hi.
Thank you so much for joining us on Notes on the Boardroom today.
My pleasure.
I've been really excited to have you on this podcast. To be honest, you have the most impressive career that I've seen, and I'm super excited to unpack that a little bit today and talk about it. So let's take it back to university. I know that you started your career in accounting like me, so let's talk a little bit about the early days.
Sure, absolutely. So, I was born in the UK here. I grew up in Yorkshire, then went to college. And, the one thing that kind of guided me very early on was my father saying, you need to have a profession, right? You need to do something that can give you longevity in a job and is very flexible and all the rest of it. And I was super good at numbers. And so somehow fell into like an accounting kind of, math and accounting degree, and then going off and joining actually a bank, right, where there were two paths that you could go, right? One was trading and sales, which probably would have been much easier and I'd have made more money early on, or the other was in accounting. But, kind of the words of my father were in my ear all the time, make sure that you learn skills and you get a kind of a qualification that you can take with you. So that's sort of why I did it. And honestly, I love accounting. I mean, it sounds super boring, but I think if you understand a balance sheet, then you can understand how business is working, right? And that people don't really understand that until they're in the weeds of it. But it's in every business and every job I've ever had, being able to look at a balance sheet and understand what that's telling me about the health of the company has been invaluable throughout my career.
Yeah, that's amazing. I do agree. I think understanding accounting and understanding finance gives you such a good foundation to understand every single other aspect of the business. So how long did you spend in accounting, and then what did that transition look like into technology?
Sure. So I would say, I went to work for a Swiss bank, right? And then I've worked, through the day, and then I went to college at night to do my accounting exams. And I probably did that for three to 4 years, right? And I got qualified as an accountant. And I started in horrible jobs. My first job was reconciling, nostros and getting 2 telexes each day and reconciling numbers. It was an awful job, right? It was, terrible. But I always maintain you do that the best way you possibly can with a big smile on your face and somebody gives you something else to do, right? So I did that. Then I ended up in kind of an FP&A type function. And, I became the controller for a particular business. And I was always trying to find, honestly, ways to make it easier to do my job, right? And there were always new developments coming on the scene, technology-wise. It was really early days. I mean, we didn't even have a multi-currency trial balance at the time. It was kind of crazy, like the lack of technology altogether. But every time somebody said, oh, we're going to put in this system or that system, you know, who can help us? I always raised my hand, right? And I think I always like understood the power of change on any process that you were doing. And I always embraced that because frankly, it gave me a chance to go and do something else, right? So I was always then dragged into all these kind of change projects. And especially we did a ton of M&A at a Swiss bank. And so it was kind of like I would do a line job and then I would do like a change job and a line job and a change job, all in finance, right? And every time I did it, then I kind of got like a, you know, better function to look at. So I sort of went from FX to rates to derivatives, you know, and it was always like more and more interesting things to look at. I did that throughout kind of most of my career in London. So I was at 10 years in the UK. And then I ended up sort of in the front office because one of the guys that whose business we bought, he kind of tapped me on the shoulder and said, I need like a COO business manager type that can come work on the trading floor for me. And so I did that. We acquired a company. They were based in Chicago and they couldn't get any of the tech guys to come to London, right? All the traders were in London and they said, you know, we need somebody to kind of go and see what's going on. Will you be interested to go to the US for 3 years? I just married Mike and he was from Chicago. So I was like, yay, you know, I get to kind of go live in America for a few years. Now it's 30 years later. But you know, that, and then when I went over there, I kind of ended up like, but it's still in the business. I worked for the head of the business, but helping them define an IT strategy and, you know, how much money we were going to spend on change, et cetera, et cetera. And I did that for the next like 3 years. Okay. Then I ended up going over to New York, right? And we were doing the merger with UBS. It was Y2K, and it was also the introduction of the euro. So there was this huge, like, kind of, you know, coming together of lots of different change initiatives. And I did all of this from my seat in the COO, and then I got pregnant, right? And the CIO at the time tapped me on the shoulder and said, okay, we need to have a discussion here, right? One, you spend 75% of your time on the road. Two, you're a pain in the ass because you tell everybody what to do and you don't actually know how to do any of the technology yourself, right? And, you know, three, like you've gotten too senior without really knowing enough of like some of the basics around technology. And so with a combination of you being pregnant and, you know, not being able to travel as much, we think you should move into technology and actually run a function, right? And I was devastated. I went home and I said, like, oh my God, I've just been fired and, you know, like life is terrible and I've been given data IT to run, which is like the worst possible IT function that I could imagine ever having to do. And then instead of like working with the head of the business, I was like 3 levels down in the IT function, right? And it was the best thing that anybody could ever have done for me, right? Because then I had to understand how engineers worked. I had to understand how product works. I had to understand, you know, how you had to procure like ahead of what you needed in terms of, you know, infrastructure and like run a function and manage people. Yeah. And so throughout then I would say like the 4 years of being, you know, pregnant and having kids and going off on maternity leave, I managed to my strategy was give the job to the best and most competent person, which by the way is the best advice you can give anybody, is find absolutely the best people that you can find to do your job. And then that frees you up to go and do something else. But it does take an amount of, you know, like kind of braveness and confidence that often people don't have because they feel like if they kind of expose themselves to not being so busy, that they might be out of a job. I took the opposite kind of view, which was if I don't have to do this shitty job any longer, maybe somebody will give me a better job to do. So that's kind of my journey into technology, right? It was, you know, kind of, it wasn't really so deliberate, but, you know, I love technology, change, data, you know, and that sort of, you know, then it became my passion, I would say.
That's amazing, and it's worked out pretty well. Gosh, there's so much I want to unpack in there. I think there's a lot of overlap between finance and technology, especially these days. I feel like I see a new AI tool announced every day at this point. I'm always doing demos. I'd love to know a little bit about what early technology looked like when you were first, automating processes and trying to make things better.
Yeah. I mean, it was horrific compared to today, right? It was awful. And I think the biggest, so, the first major step change was obviously the internet, right? Where you had, all of a sudden there was so much more that was public and people had access to things and data, but it didn't. It had an impact in banking, but not the same impact as other things did. So I would say for us, the first major change was when like cloud computing really took off, right? And prior to that, you'd have an idea. You're going to build a technology. We started obviously with mainframes, right? And then distributed systems came a bit later on. And then, but you always, if you wanted to build something, you had to plan ahead. Like, I'm going to need X servers, I'm going to need X capacity and networks and, all this kind of thing, right? And so you would have to budget what you thought you might need, right? And so you would always over budget everything you ever needed, because if you under egged it, then, you wanted to put something into production. 3 months later, you wanted to scale it, it didn't work, right? So everybody went for overcapacity. So you spent a fortune, right, on things you really didn't need. And then when cloud came in and there was this elasticity, and you could use compute when you needed it, and then somebody else can use it overnight. It was like that was like a revolution for us, right? We were like, oh my gosh, this is a whole new way of doing things, right? I think that was one big thing. Then service-oriented architectures to us were like, a whole another new world, right? Where you could create components that could be reused. And for me, that was a huge turning point, right? Where I took on, so I came back and ran tech functions, right? Then I was asked to go and run operations, and I said, oh, I don't think I should run operations. I've never done operations. I don't, know anything about it. And somebody said, no, we need to automate everything that is done in operations, or, automate some of it. And we just need a change mindset that somebody's happy to go look at this. So then I kind of took the other side of things. So I was looking at the business outcomes and then starting with like, how do you use technology to really automate things? And there were two schools of thought, right? People use like the sort of early robotics to just automate like everything a bit and make it easier. And then other people said, no, let's fundamentally rethink, right, how we do this and start with good data, create the components on top of it. And that's kind of where I got really interested in how best to architect things. And that, I think that was the next wave of productivity for, from my point of view. And then lastly, when, obviously data has been, to me, the heart of almost every career choice that I've taken since I left UBS, right? And when I became the CIO at UBS, I was sort of handed this big problem. I'd gone through the financial crisis, I have some fun stories about being at the Fed on the day of Lehman failure and all that kind of thing. And, when I came out the other side of that, they said, well, we want you to be CIO of UBS. And I was like, oh, don't be stupid. I'm not technical enough. I can't possibly lead 20,000, technologists. And they were like, you have 20,000 technologists. We don't need you to be a deep one. We just need you to be able to lead, right? And so then I really got excited about the fact that there was this, kind of moment where you could reuse technology across loads of different parts of the firm instead of it having to like rebuild it in every function, right? And I had a huge challenge to take a massive amount of cost out, which comes with a lot of heartache because you have to take a lot of people out at the same time, right? And some of those people will reskill and go and do different things, and other times there aren't roles for them, and that's a big. That's now the next wave of that is happening now, right? With AI, it's kind of insane how much work can be done with AI in so many different industries. And, I think this step change is going to require like a lot more thought from governments and, you know, like the social side of this as to how life is going to look like for people where there isn't just the amount of work, right? It's the first time I've, you know, really sat back and thought about that. But anyway, a sort of bit of a rambly answer to your question.
No, that's really interesting. I'd love to go in a little bit deeper on you becoming CIO of UBS. Yeah. That's, you know, a huge role, a lot of responsibility, 20,000 people. Tell me a little bit about how you face those kinds of hard decisions and letting people go. What runs through your mind when someone asks you to, you know, do something like that?
Honestly, my first sort of thought was it's too much, right? So I have 4 children. You know, I'd always been traveling 24/7, and, you know, I felt like the whole thing was a bit overwhelming, right? And so my immediate reaction was like, no, it's not for me, right? And I'd also got my heart set on becoming the COO of the investment bank. So that was a job I wanted. Somebody just offered it to me. And so, but then I quickly realized that the request wasn't really a request. It was sort of an order to do that job, right? And I also spoke to the CIO that originally brought me into technology when I first became pregnant, right? And I called him and I said, you know, because he's always been, you know, one of my mentors. And I said, what do you think? And he said, listen, nobody ever is going to offer you that job again, right? You're going to be in charge of $5 billion of tech spend. You can really change like the trajectory of the bank with this job, right? And so what are you waiting for, right? You know, you've got the skills, you've got the, you know, the opportunity, right? The time is now to go and do it. And so I kind of, you know, woke myself up from sort of being afraid, right? And then I did what I always do, which is surround myself with the very, very best people, right, that you can find for every job. And not only that, but people who can work together as well, right? Because you can't, you know, it's one thing to have all the smartest guys in the room, but they've also got to be able to work together, right? And, you know, recognize that not everybody has the same skills, and, you know, what I'm good at, other people aren't going to be good at, or what they're good at, I'm not good at. And so you surround yourself with like a collection of experience and skills that gives you a much better chance of success. And I think that creating, you know, strong teams is, you know, at the real heart of any business success, no matter what type of business it is. You have to be able to admit where your strengths and weaknesses are. And sometimes, you know, those weaknesses are things that you just know you're never going to change about yourself, right? Yeah. Like, I'm never going to be able to not say something if it bothers me, right? I've learned to say it in, you know, kinder, nicer ways than I might have said it when I was 25, right? But I'm not the person, you know, there are things that I have challenges where I'm like, okay, is this important battle to fight now? Or is somebody who works for me going to realize that this is an important battle and they're going to fight it or they're going to change it? So you mature into how to operate. And that I had to do a lot of maturing during that time. So I had a friend, she was from like Thailand, okay? And so didn't look like she would speak German, okay? But spoke German fluently. And her and her husband were both working for me in technology. And she was sitting on the floor in Zurich the day that they announced that I was going to be CIO, right? And the whole conversation was, oh, the announcement must have been wrong because it said Michelle, not Michael. How could a woman be in charge of technology, right? That was only in 2009.
Wow.
Right? So that was what I faced, was like, first of all, a really Anglo-Saxon feeling that I first had to face. Then it was like, how could a woman possibly be qualified to do this job? And, you know, and I think those sort of moments toughen you up to, you know, I was like, why can't a woman do this job? Right? I can be successful. I don't have to be as technical as every single person in the room, but I have to find the people that I really trust, you know, to drive the architecture, to drive the infrastructure. And so that was kind of my first real lesson, I think, in becoming a CIO. And then the other is like, you know, often when you have to say to somebody, this is the end of the road, right? at the time, first of all, you have to do it always well, right? So I always say to all my kids and everybody that I sort of mentor, be nice, right? Because you just don't know when that person's going to come around again in your career, right? And, it's a small world in many ways. And, you always should have, I think, empathy at the heart of the way in which you do anything. And, my mum always used to say, 2 wrongs don't make a right. And I totally try and live by that. So, if people are being assholes to me, right, I'll smile through it as much as I possibly can because, I sort of think I'll see you on the other side, right? And I wouldn't say I act like a killer, but I'm certainly not, afraid to have a long, I think I can play a long game on things, right? And so many occasions, whether it's on a decision that we have to make on a business or, somebody who's being really, really difficult or somebody who I know isn't quite going to make it, time can generally help some of these things play out. You can't take too much time to make decisions, especially in the world we live in now, but you can take the time to make sure that the way you treat people is the right way.
Yeah, that's such a good leadership philosophy. I can't believe in 2009 that, it wasn't that long ago, the response was that to you becoming CIO. What kind of other things have people said to you? And also, how do you deal with that? Because if it was me, I know I'd be quite hurt.
I think you just can't take things personally, right? I generally have this philosophy that, when somebody comes in and they're awful to you, they're unreasonable, let's say, okay, right? Most often I think it's their problem, it's not my problem, right? They're having a bad day, they don't need to ruin my day, right? And I think it's this sort of shield that you put up, and I just, in many ways, decide what I'm going to let bother me or not, right? With my 4 kids, if I thought somebody was really, doing the wrong thing to them, then, that's there's a more emotional reaction to it, or Mike, right? Or one of my nephews or whatever. But I think when it comes to business, you sort of have to somehow, I'm passionate, but not overly emotional, right? And that does tend to stand you in better stead, right? And I was not always like that, okay? I would have been way over emotional about things when I was, when I was younger. And I remember the very first year I joined Swiss Bank, we had it was a graduate training program, and I was the last one that was admitted, okay? And so I maybe started a month after everybody else, and it got to the end of the year, and my first salary was £7,500, right? And at the end of the year, they were kind of giving everybody a salary increase of, I don't know, something like 8,000, right? And they didn't give me one, right? And I must have said at lunch to somebody I was expecting to get a salary increase. Anyway, the rest of the graduates who were on the program all basically went to the manager and said, no. She does exactly the same job we do. She's just as good as we are. In fact, we think we might end up working for her, right? She should have the pay rise as well, right? And that really was a moment for me where I was like, okay, if you treat people well, you get treated well. And if I like to be fair, okay? I can be tough, but I think you always need to be fair and be able to defend whatever decision you took, right? So transparency is super important to me, being straightforward with people, and not hiding behind other people as well. But look, I've had to face all sorts of things. I remember one woman who was on the board of our company at UBS, not the external board, but the internal board, told me that if I wore high heels and short skirts, I would have a better chance of being promoted to the board, right? She didn't last very long at the board level, yeah? I think you just have to get quite a thick skin to a lot of this, and you have to, I fortunately rarely had imposter syndrome. I've rarely had it, right? I have philosophy when you take a job, that you take something where you know you can bring a ton of skills and experience to it. But I've always selfishly wanted to do something where I'm going to also learn, right? And so, but if you have that confidence of, I know what I'm doing, or I know I'm good at this and that, it can overcompensate for like anything else. And, you know, like, why shouldn't I be confident in what I'm doing? So that's, you know, and it's not easy to get that confidence, but it's, I think it's important, right?
Create it and you can build it. I want to touch a little bit on the financial crisis. You mentioned you have a lot of great stories around that. What was it like working, for one of the biggest banks in the world during that time?
Kind of crazy.
Yeah, I can imagine.
I got a call then, and we all knew obviously that, what was about to happen on that Friday night. Months before, we knew how many different places were in trouble. But I remember we were at some friend's house, and I got a call from actually the COO of the bank, and he said, meet me at the Fed 6 a.m. tomorrow morning. And I said, what do you want me to bring? And he said, just your brain. That's all you're going to need tomorrow, right? And so I showed up, obviously. And at the time I was running our operations. And really at that point in time, a lot of what we could do to manage risk was all in operations, right? Because it kind of didn't matter at that point what credit agreement said, or, you had to act on your feet and preserve cash, because that's really what put, so many people, was a liquidity crisis, right? And so we were at the Fed. I remember sitting almost opposite Jamie Dimon, right? Who was still the guy that everybody listened to. I was Lloyd Blankfein was a couple down, and I was obviously in the back row, not saying a word, of course, just listening to it all. But there was 3 or 4 people from each firm that were allowed in the room. I subsequently found out other, Merrill Lynch guys were upstairs because they were kind of next in line. And I listened to the debate, and when I remember distinctly when Ben Bernanke and Tim Geithner came in the room, I was like, oh my God, I might pass out now. Right? It's like, there's so much power in this room, and just listening, but realizing that nobody had the answers. Absolutely nobody had the answers. They came up with a whole bunch of different ways to try and solve for the crisis in the moment. Then he found out they were, not legal, or wouldn't solve, we only solve for one bank failure, not for more bank failures. So it was very interesting to watch and observe, and then, to kind of live through that. So, we were in huge trouble at UBS as well, massive trouble. We were, several days behind the other, several other banks, right? So I more or less was in charge of kind of running the day-to-day, right? And I think at one point in time we were running about 10 concurrent bankruptcies, including, Iceland, and, it was kind of insane. We had no technology that helped us. So we literally had cash flows on flip charts where we were looking at what the next 10 days of cash looked like as far as we could see it, which was, not the best, right? We had tech, but not that was equipped to help us manage that type of a crisis at all. And I remember, I won't say the name of the bank, but one of the banks on Tuesday, guys came in. I've got the payments people. So the other lesson I'll tell you is there's 2 things from that, right? One is you have to see when people are at their limits from an exhaustion perspective. So several times I had to send people home and say, go back and sleep and come back tomorrow. This person's in charge, right? And so I think in any business, you have to make sure that you don't, when there's a crisis, that you are taking care that people aren't just continuing to work and then they start making huge mistakes, right? Also, you bring the people that are immediately the most important to the crisis to the table right then. So I remember the Fed wire guys, who basically released the payments. I made them sit outside my office, right? And any payment over a certain amount of money, which sounds ridiculous, they came in and said, what do you think? Should we do this? Should we not do that? So I remember was Tuesday, I think. It was either Monday morning or Tuesday. One of them came in and they said, one of the major banks is saying we're not paying value today. We're only paying, we're not paying anything out unless it's value today and people call for it, right? And so I was like, that's not good. And I called the CIO of that bank and I said, and he was very upset, sort of yelled at me and said, like, how dare you say that's what we're saying? And I said, listen, it's no skin off my nose, okay? We're in a crisis, we're all in it together. I think you should know. Then he called back about an hour later and he said, I owe you a huge apology and a big dinner when we're through this crisis, because he called his own payment center and had the same messaging from the payment center. So I think the other thing was everybody sort of had to work together a bit. Like, you could have really screwed other people. And when you're in a existential crisis like that, I think you have to have, a bit more like empathy. It's like 9/11. It's like, any of those type of crises, this superstorm Sandy, right? We had a office in Midtown, wasn't being used. And actually the CEO of a company called me and said, do you think you could, or it was actually the head of banking called me and said, could you help this guy out? Their offices were at DTCC downtown in Manhattan. They were completely their whole office was flooded, right? And they were a data provider to the industry and they had no space, right? And he said, can you help me? And I called him and I said, listen, the pipes are there. You can come in and use it. I can't give you any people. It's completely empty. You guys can take it and use it. Now, I remember one of our senior leaders being a bit irritated with me that we helped them. But I said, there'll be a day when we'll need help and we need to pick up the phone. And I want people to remember that, we acted the right way and that we helped people. So I think, that empathy has to come through, like, in how you manage every day as well.
Yeah, that's amazing. And also, to your point, you never know when you'll be the one in need. So I think it's always good to help people where you can. An event like that, everybody's in the same boat. It's a crisis for everyone. And I think it's really important to come together. Was there any lessons from going through that experience as a leader that, shaped you and you've taken forward into the future?
Yeah, I think so that made me a risk manager, right? I don't think I'd ever really had to manage that scale of risk ever, right? Or be the person who had to make a decision, if that makes sense, right? So like, I remember the night that we were bailed out by the Swiss National Bank and there was like, I couldn't find anybody and I had to make a decision as to whether we were going to make a margin call payment or not. And there was an AIG payment and they were bailed out the same night. And so it was a lot of pressure, right? To like figure out, what do you do? Because if you don't release it was, anyway, complex stuff. But just to say that, first of all, being completely in charge of a risk decision that has hundreds of millions of dollars impact if you get it wrong, you have to, be very clear how you risk manage that situation. So I would say that definitely like has stayed with me now, that when I'm thinking about any decision I'm making in business, I think about risk at the same time. Like I would say, like we always thought about risk, but it was always maybe a bit later on, right? So that definitely kind of changed my perspective on risk. And then the other thing was that data was really sparse, okay, right? They just couldn't get your hands on the right data. I mean, the crisis for me, emanated out of lack of good data in the first place. People didn't understand what was in credit agreements. They didn't understand, what risks they were running because they didn't really understand the companies that they were doing business with and all the individuals they were doing business with. I mean, it was a data crisis, as was Enron, and when you think back and you look back at all these different crises in financial services, a lack of data sort of sits at the heart of them. And, so I am a data junkie, like, I always have been. And I think, if you have good, clean data, you sort of, originate it well, you keep it, it really helps you run a business effectively, and I make data-driven decisions, right? So I think that also helps you be confident when you're in running a business, that you're not letting emotion create like the answer or the narrative that you want it to create. You're thinking about what the data is telling you, and that will help you make better decisions. I mean, in many ways, UBS was very lucky to have gone through the crisis as they did. If you think about how this played out, right? We were very early to restructure our businesses, get into businesses that we should have been in, that we shouldn't have been in, and reshape that business to be a strong franchise, right? So that, they, and I'd left by then, but they were in a much stronger position when Credit Suisse was in trouble to basically take that opportunity and create the franchise that they are today, right? So I would say data and risk management were the two things that really, I think anybody that came through that crisis feels probably the same way I do.
I couldn't agree more on the data point, especially in our day-to-day jobs as well, building financial models for people. It's all, data in and data out. If the source data that's feeding it is not in good shape, then how can our financial model give you anything useful?
100%, right? I will also tell you a sense of humor is a good thing to have. So I'll tell you two funny things that happened. I was with one of my colleagues at the Fed that day, and they had coasters on the table that had like a Fed, embossed stamp on the coasters. And I remember him leaning forward and whispering to me, "Michelle, put some of those coasters in your purse, and you and I are never getting invited back here." Which I thought was just absolutely, brilliant. And then when I left UBS, the guys produced the Fed Wire, where we had basically gone out to AIG and said, we will all stay here all night, right? Because the AIG, CEOs and treasurers and CFOs had said, we will resolve this before the end of the day. But, we couldn't pay out these Asian currencies until we got our dollars from them. And so I got like a framed, Fed Wire thing that says, it's not often that ops guys ask for $650 million and get it. So, I think also keeping a sense of humor in most situations also helps you through those things, because these things are stressful.
Exactly. Life's about balance.
Yes.
And,
exactly.
of course, you need to be really good at your job and be all over everything, but also, having a joke and not being too serious, I think makes things a little bit easier. Do you still have the coaster?
I do. Yes. Yeah.
That's an amazing souvenir. You did 25 years at UBS.
Longer.
That is amazing. I think, in today's generation, I think people advocate job hopping and changing and moving on. And I think there's pros and cons to both. But talk to me a little bit about how spending time at UBS helped you grow versus maybe had you jumped ship and gone somewhere else.
Yeah, look, I still think you need to do a different job every 2 or 3 years, right? But, I was lucky enough at UBS to be given opportunities to change kind of jobs every couple of years, right? And I think good organizations do that for people, right? They put them, look, the only person who's going to build your career is you. Yeah. Like, I firmly believe that, okay? The skills or the opportunities people give you to learn are great, but it's all about what you do and how you take, the bull by the horns and lead your own career, right? But UBS and other good institutions, they give you like the opportunity to learn new skills, to get new experiences, and then be ready. And when anybody ever comes to me and says, what should I do next? I say, okay, what skills have you got now? Like, look at where you'd like to be and figure out the next move you make has to give you the skills and the experience that you don't have today, right? Yeah, work backwards to, okay, I'm here, I want to go over there. How do I get there? And, I think it's going to become even more important. We did the first version of workforce planning, right? Where we, mapped out like job families and, could you go from being an ops analyst to, ultimately becoming the CIO? Like, who would have kind of thought you could do that, or an accounting analyst, whatever. And we mapped all of that out. And I think it's going to become even more important now with like AI and the pace of things moving, that people really think about like what skills are important to the workforce, to the planet on a go-forward basis, and figure out how to, grow those skills. I'm not afraid for, but, I think it is tough to be in the market. So I read an article 2 days ago that said in New York City, the number of internships had dropped 60% in the last 12 months because of AI, because people are too afraid to take on interns because they don't think they'll need those number of staff when they're done across like all these different industries in New York.
This is one, scary, but two, what it makes me think about is, okay, let's say AI can do the jobs that interns do. What happens in 5 years when those interns would have become middle management? Are we going to have a massive hole there? Yeah. What happens to like the traditional triangular hierarchy that you have in an organization in 5 years? And
in all honesty, people are going to have to hire juniors again, right? You can't not do it, okay? Because there's no way to learn how to be a manager if you've never done the jobs.
Exactly. You've led so many people in your career. I'm keen to know how important leadership and mentoring for you was throughout your career. Has there been anyone, that you've looked up to, that's helped you, that's mentored you?
There's tons of people that I would consider to be mentors that I would say constantly I learn from. And, I don't think I could ever have built my career without those people. Some of them, so most of them who I would call mentors, obviously, I felt really helped me. Okay, right? I'll tell you the truth, though, there are others that I look at and I, vowed never to operate like they did, right? Yeah. So it's interesting, you don't count them as like, friends or mentors, but, you learn a lot from just being observant. I have great mentors who honestly help me with so many different things. I mean, I think the best mentors are the ones that really tell you the brutal, honest truth. Like, when you're behaving like an asshole, they tell you you're behaving like an asshole. When when you aren't thinking about a problem well, the right way, when you aren't being strategic, when you aren't, like there's so many different people that have kind of yelled at me and told me, you're not doing this right, or you weren't nice to this person, or you yelled at this, and all of those things, it's hard to take the feedback. Sometimes, I was talking to somebody yesterday at Deutsche, and she and I were saying, sometimes I just want to go home and like cry, right? But you do that in private, and then you come back the next day and you say like, okay, I have to be better, right? If I want to have the right, it's a privilege to lead people. Okay, it's not a burden, right? If it's a burden, then you're not the right person for that job, right? Yeah. If you see it as a privilege, I think all the roles that I've had the opportunity to do and the boards that I've served on, they're a privilege to have, right? And we don't get everything right all day, every day, okay? But you have to make sure that the balance of, getting it right versus not getting it right is higher, and listening versus talking. That's another one that you have to get the balance right on, right? And also learning from mistakes, right? So, listen, mistakes happen all day long, and, they've happened in every business. I've made mistakes. You all make mistakes, but I don't want to see the same mistake being made over and over again. That doesn't mean you haven't, that it won't happen twice, okay? But like 3 times, too much is too much, right? For my taste, right? You have to spend, you have to really think about what was the root cause. And sometimes those are hard things to think about, right? They're things that you don't really want to admit that you messed up on, right? I remember shouting at somebody when I was in Chicago because the traders were shouting at me because they wanted this risk reporting system, and and he was like, coming in at, 8 and leaving at 3. And, I was like, trying to hold my kind of, cool about it all. And then one day I just blew up at him, and he said, okay, fine. You figure out how to do it then. Wow. Right. And he just walked out. And, I was like, oh shit, I have no idea how to do this. Like, I don't know. I would know now. I'd probably like figure it out with AI, right? But at the time, it was like horrifying. Yeah. And I had to go to his house and beg him to come back in. Yeah. And it was like, you know, he came back, but like I never did that again.
So you learn from your mistakes. That's a good mentality that you need in the workplace and in life in general. Nobody's perfect and we all make mistakes, but there comes a time where you have to look in the mirror and say, why did that happen?
Yeah.
And become better.
Yeah.
How would you describe your leadership style in general? And also, has that evolved over time?
I think right now I'm a data-driven, passionate, empathetic leader. That's how I'd like to think of myself. I don't know whether everybody would describe me like that. Definitely people would describe me as passionate and data-driven. You know, I think I'm a strong leader, like as in, you know, I have strong opinions, you know, and I definitely, you know, will voice those, but I'm also very fair, right? Like nobody would ever accuse me of not being fair, right? And I would say my style has only softened over time. So I had a mentor once and she said, you know, when the higher you get, the quieter you can be because everybody's going to listen to you anyway. And so you don't have to, you know, tell everybody what to do or be very bossy or, you know, like prescriptive. You have to become that leader that can say, this is the outcome I'm looking for, right? And just quietly lead people. And I've tried to do that, right? I think, you know, so there's different pieces of advice that you learn along the way. And just as you get older, you don't have that same, like, you know, I still have the same passion for everything. So, you know, I'm super passionate about, you know, whatever it is about Deutsche Bank being successful, I'm super passionate about Zinnia being successful, you know, but you're not, you don't have that same, like, I think, urgent way of operating that you do when you're younger. Or at least I did, right, you know.
Yeah, interesting. Let's talk about Zinnia for a bit. So I'm super keen to learn a little bit about that transition from CIO at UBS to CEO at Zinnia.
Yes, well, I had a big stop in the middle, okay, so I was 5 years at market, where I learned to run a business, okay, so when I left UBS, I went to market, and I went to market largely because I met somebody in PE who just put a lot of money into market, and he said, you should go and learn, the guy who runs market is like the best business leader I've ever met. He's not really a technologist, you're a technologist, but you don't really haven't led any businesses. You know, again, it goes back to sort of the philosophy I have, which is you know, kind of give to get, right? And so I learned how to run a business. I ended up running like an $800 million business at IHS Market. I went through an IPO, most interesting, you know, prepping for an IPO, being part of that, going through it, but thinking it was massively successful. It was, but then our stock price did nothing for a year. And then learning from IHS about, well, you know, you can't just sort of sit back and say, well, we built a great franchise and it's producing X, Y, and Z and it's all hunky-dory. You know, you kind of got to continue to reinvent and, you know, evolve as a business. And then, you know, after did that for 5 years, I then decided like, oh, I'm going to do advisory, not, you know, be kind of full-time doing anything. And that's when I met the Eldridge team and ended up getting involved via a board actually called Global Atlantic that I was on, where it was like so obvious to me that the same problem that we were solving at market, which is let's build good market infrastructure for, you know, a broad range of participants in that market, banks, hedge funds, asset managers, build it once, build it well. It doesn't differentiate everybody to build it themselves and distribute it many times, right? That's a great business to be in, okay? And then I came into insurance and I was like, what is going on in this business, okay? It's like 20 years behind financial services, right? There's no common market infrastructure, right? The products, the annuities, the life insurance policies are really complicated, not because they're as difficult to sort of model as a derivative, but because, you know, they last for 30 years, okay? They have a huge number of attributes to them. A lot of them are underwritten based on health or, you know, potential health, etc., right? then these are non-trivial products, okay? And, the manufacturing was done by insurance companies, many of which were still, as far as I could see, like decades behind thinking around technology. It's also governed in a very, so you think global regulation is tough, and the Fed and the, PRA, and they're not easy regulators to deal with. Try dealing with 50 state regulators, okay? Because insurance is regulated at the state level because it's consumer driven, right? And so, they're right to protect it, but now you've got 50 sets of rules, or not quite 50 because some of them pool their needs, but you've got a lot of different rules and regulations, right? So it breeds more conservatism into how people operate. And, so it's a really tough industry. But I think it was right for disruption and to build a tech company around the premise that let's build it once again. Let's go back to, let's build a service-oriented architecture, one system of record. We built it on top of distributed ledger. We, then we componentized all the things that you do. And it's a logical way of building technology for that industry. But you have to gain a lot of trust. When I first came to that company, everybody hated us. Everybody. All of our customers, right? They all hated us because they, the service wasn't good enough. The trades were not represented properly in the platform. It was really, really hard work, right? And fundamentally, that was the case because we hadn't got our own technology, right? We built on top of other people's technology, and we hadn't done the hard work to really build a tech, franchise. And so that was the last 5 years. And listen, at the end of the day, the reason I love Zinnia is because more people need financial longevity, right? People need life insurance policies. They need, things like annuities that will give you good tax advantage, ways to have earned streams of income in the future. And why do people not trust those products? Because they can't see and feel them. They don't know how to engage with them. Most people still say, I have a life insurance policy. If I die, it's sitting in this drawer, right? So people will go out and buy crypto, or they'll buy, products that, they can touch and feel, and they can liquidate easily, or they can see how it grows. And so my passion was to make sure that those products gain the transparency and the trust. Because I think when people trust things, they do more of it, whether it's, makeup products, or it's life insurance policies, or, buying, plane tickets. I think if you trust something and you trust the service you're going to get, then you're more likely to lean in.
Yeah, I read in a book that everything in business, and in life for that matter, comes down to trust. Yeah. Ultimately, that's what drives relationships. That's what drives decisions. Absolutely everything is trust.
It's hugely important. And when you haven't got it, you haven't got it in people, then you know that you have to move on, and
Wow. I mean, you've done some really big roles at really big companies. I'm really keen to learn how you've managed doing all of that and delivering with personal life and family. And you mentioned you have 4 kids, and I'm sure everyone's
with a great husband. Okay, that's the number one, right? Because he agreed to give up his career and stay home to help raise 4 kids. And you can't. It's very difficult to have lots of kids and not have somebody who's more dedicated to to raising them on a day-to-day, hour-by-hour basis, which is not easy to do. But I also, I've always said, I'm in Hong Kong, doesn't matter, call me in the middle of the night, right? You need some help, you need some, me time, right? So I've tried to be accessible. I'm sure if they were all sitting here, they probably would not agree that I was always as accessible, right? But I think I've always tried to be, to be there for them. But it's you have to figure out how to balance your life. And when I left UBS, largely it was because, I woke up one day and I said, I can't remember 10 great things that we did as a family this year. because I had too much stress in the job. And so that was a sign for me that it was time to change something.
That was the turning point. I mean, your kids have the most amazing example in terms of a mentor and someone.
Not sure about that, but
That's amazing. We tend to finish off our episodes with 3 quickfire questions.
Sure.
So the first one is, has there been a book that has impacted your life massively?
Well, so I mean, it sounds a crazy little thing, okay? And this is not really, it's about work life rather than, home life. But there was a book called that My Iceberg is Melting. And it really helped me. It was a little book about penguins on an iceberg, and it was the youngest penguin that went off and figured out, there was no chance that iceberg was going to survive, and so they had to find a different way of doing it. And when I ran operations at UBS, it was like what I needed to explain to people in, very simple terms, and I think even now it's very relevant. I'm sure if I read the book, it would feel super dated, but it's like, it was a good book to help you think about, sometimes it just isn't a way back. You have to think about change and a way forward. Right. So that's probably, one book.
Is there a moment in your career where you experienced a major crossroads and you had to make a big decision for yourself personally?
Oh, I think the CIO role was probably the biggest role. Also, maybe making that decision to leave UBS. I'd been 25 years. I've kind of felt like, my left arm was cut off because it's just so, you feel like it sort of runs through your veins. And I'm on the board of Deutsche Bank, and, it's funny how much passion I have for that. I didn't think I could ever have the same passion for another bank, but I think those were kind of, those were 2 big crossroads. And also the one I explained earlier, when somebody told me you have to stop talking about technology and go and do it, sometimes that what you feel are bad things that are happening to you become the best opportunities that you have.
Yeah, hindsight is a wonderful thing.
Yeah, isn't it?
So I'm very inspired by you. And I'm 28 years old right now. So what would you say to your 28-year-old self?
So somebody gave me a great piece of advice that your career is a marathon, right? And nobody runs the same marathon. Yeah. People start quickly, they start slowly, they speed up, they take a break, and there's so many different ways to run a great marathon. And so if you can own your own career and your own trajectory, that is something I would probably have said really early on. But, many people work in big organizations and they compare themselves. Oh, Joe Schmo got this, and, Claudia got this, and, and I think be your own person, figure out what is going to work for you and have that confidence for yourself. And I think also, a lot of people ask me this question about when to have kids, right? And I say, do it whenever you want to. There is never a good time. Do not wait and worry about what somebody might think or say, right? It's the best advice I could give to people, right? It doesn't mean I think everybody should have them super early or super late or whatever, but you have to do what's right for you.
Yeah.
And if you have an employer that doesn't treat you well when you go out on maternity leave, they're not a good employer to work for.
Yeah. That's some pretty solid advice. I think that's really a good one to end it on. So thank you so much, Michele. Really
You're so
appreciate
welcome.
it.